And then we'll get started. If you are joining us on the recording on Zoom, all you've missed so far is us singing to Marietta, and I decided not to record that.
Thank you.
You don't have much faith in our voices, do you?
No, it's really about my own. Thank you. So today is Marietta's 101st birthday, and we are delighted to be able to celebrate with her here on Zoom. All right. And so here is our prayer for this morning, and it comes from Patrick Otuma, who is part of the Corrymeela community in Ireland, and a spiritual writer whose work is very important to me. Let us pray. It's a prayer about courage. Courage comes from the heart, and we are always welcomed by God, the heart of all being. We bear witness to our faith, knowing that we are called to live lives of courage, love, and reconciliation in the ordinary and extraordinary moments of each day. We bear witness too to our failures and our complicity in the fractures of our world. May we be courageous today. May we learn today. May we love today. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. I love that phrase, the ordinary and extraordinary moments of each day, because there are so many extraordinary moments. All right. So last week, we read the first 18 verses of chapter 38, which is God finally responding to Job after 37 chapters of, 36 chapters really, of Job complaining and sharing his plight, and his friends, of course, giving him questionable counsel. And so now God responds. So we'll hear from God in the rest of chapter 38 and chapter 39, and like the first verse or two of chapter 40. And then Job will speak again. Job will have a rebuttal to God.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm just gonna so hopefully, if we could get through the rest of 38 and maybe 39 today, I realize that's aspirational, but I think as we read it, you'll see, I think it's going to go a little bit more quickly than some of the other chapters. Then next week, we could get to Job speaking at the end, and we're in shooting distance of finishing Job because there are 42 chapters. And so if we don't finish it next week, I would certainly say by the following week, we would wrap up. And so we'll continue to think about what comes next. All right. Before we pick up at chapter verse 19, does anyone want to say anything about the first 18 verses and what God says to Job there? Or summarize what God says to Job?
I'll summarize it.
Thank you.
He's touting himself rather than answering Job's question. He's, in effect, he's parading his bona fides for being all powerful.
That's an odd way. That's an odd way of putting it. Mostly, I think he's pointing out that sort of calling Job to task. Who do you think you are to make these demands? Any kind of demands? What have you got?
I always have visions of the great and powerful Oz.
Yes.
Except there's no curtain.
Pay no attention to the little man behind the curtain.
I hadn't thought about that, but it does remind me of, when they all come up, but he's not answering the question, and he's not giving Job any reason. As I say, for me, it's like when your parents would say, because I said so. Why do I have to do this?
Okay, thank you. So Ellie has a different view of that. Does anybody else want to respond about what God's doing here? Or what the writers of Job are positing God saying here?
I think
I
the
think-
second verse explains it all. Who is this that darkens counsel by word? Well, mine says, who are you to question my wisdom?
Hmm. Who are you to question my wisdom? And that's, yeah, I think that's a question with which we all need to wrestle, right? In terms of, when we think about our own identity as beloved children of God, created in God's image, and we say that theologically. And at the same time, we are not God. And so God is really reminding Job of that. And so, this soliloquy by the Lord is sort of a summary of God's action in scripture, right? So we have this recapitulation of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? And, and goes on, and shut the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Well, of course, the rhetorical questions, the answer to all of these is, well, no. No. So there's not a lot Job can say to that. And to Fred's point, God doesn't answer Job's question. I wonder if that isn't the point. That does Job's question require or deserve a response from God?
Yeah.
What do you all
It-
think about that?
If God wants to be worshiped, then, there is an obligation on him to establish that he deserves worship.
It doesn't owe us anything.
I was going to say, does anyone have a problem with that?
Yeah, I have a problem with that, Fred.
I'm not going to worship a
You're
God
a
just
problem,
because
Fred. You're the
I'm
problem.
I will admit that, but I'm not going to worship a God simply on the basis of he's bigger than me.
That's a
Oh,
good,
really?
I think it's a pretty good reason.
I think so too.
Well, that's why I expect to be covered in boils at some point. You may avoid that. But God's, and that's just why churches are empty across the country and across various countries, is there doesn't seem to be any good reason to worship God, who, when he says the whole reason is I'm bigger than you, and he doesn't seem to be performing.
Well, I
It would-
think that's quite a generalization.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm not shy about it.
I think,
We know
I
Fred,
that.
think
I think you better hold back.
John
think
wanted to say
it's not just that he is bigger than me. He is the one from whom all things come, including love, joy, and peace.
Mm.
And those are worthy of being worshiped.
the source, right? Thank you for saying that, John. That was beautiful. I also
I
I don't know what that is.
kind of loud.
okay. I think it was maybe Fred.
It wasn't me.
It wasn't you? Okay, because it's
No,
when I muted
It was
you.
Jackie.
Okay,
Jack.
okay. Well, you found it. Good. That's all I cared about.
Yeah. Well, in
Um,
response to that, I would say we've had, 37 chapters now, and no one has justified God in the terms, that John did. Everybody justified God, as being powerful, as rewarding virtue, which, he hasn't. And
Except considering the era of this, I mean, this is the pre-Jesus God. So the love and the peace don't come into it. That wasn't part of the message then.
That's very well put.
Then why was he to be worshipped?
Because he was bigger than you.
Because
Okay.
he's omnipotent and he deserves worship. We
Mhm.
wouldn't be here without him.
Well, and I think that that's, it's, I agree with John that it's more than God is bigger than we are. God is and again, understanding that, as far as I know, whoever wrote down the book of Job was not sitting there with a tape recorder recording God's voice. So this is, this lengthy speech is giving voice to God, embodying God, right? But it's a summary of our source, right? So that God, if we believe that God is the source of creation, then all that we have comes from God, which then is deserving of worship and love in and of itself. So, this idea that somehow, God has to woo us, that's a human centric and anthropocentric, I guess is the word, way of looking at it, that somehow we are the arbiters of whether God is deserving of worship. And I know some people view it that way. I don't happen to be one. So that's why I think this is an important question for us to think about where we fall on this. Does God have to woo us? Does God have to win our worship, our affection, our love, or not? Fred thinks yes.
I think the state of churches in this country these days says, that he is failing in that.
I don't think so. I think people are failing.
People are failing.
People are so consumed with self that they think they don't need God. And it's also much more nuanced than that. But I would
Yeah.
hope to say that God is failing us.
Well, and I think God is according to the authors of Job, because we're close enough to the end, you can peek ahead, and he says the three friends didn't know what they were talking about.
Mhm.
That's the whole point of this thing, is the vending machine God who smites the wicked and holds up the good. They don't know what they're talking about.
Well,
And
that
we-
was Job's attitude also.
And I think it's our attitude as well. We've all been, kind of questioning the friends all throughout this. So absolutely. All right.
Well,
Oh,
can
go ahead. Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it was Donna or Kim last week that said, faith. You have to have faith.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, Christianity has sold this on a couple of different aspects. One was you just have to have faith. Another was, promising good things. And if you don't get them now, you'll get them in the next life, which was, also a matter of having faith.
Mm-hmm.
But in all of that is the assumption that, God is, and it comes down to, why are you worshiping? Why do we gather every Sunday to worship? And it, for me, it's not because I'm afraid of being smitten, or because I think I'm, or because I think there's something in it for me necessarily. There is something in it for me, actually. But, it's not a material thing, and it's not
Mhm.
something that I
Agreed.
expect, I expect you to deliver immediately. It's something I will deliver to myself almost. And that's between me and, whatever power is there.
Okay. Anybody else have thoughts they want to share about that?
I like this chapter because it's not even so much God speaking as that the author is putting these words into God's mouth to explain why God should be worshipped. I don't think that God is boasting. I think this is the author saying, just think about this. And he puts the words into God's mouth, just as a, I mean, I think it would be awkward to have Elihu say this, although he's made his own case in this direction. But this sounds like the author is just talking to all of his characters as well as to all of his readers.
Hmm.
Well, I think the author is outlining a theology.
Mhm.
And, to me, the theology fails.
Well, it's the basis for the theology. Why should we worship God? It's not just because he can smite me, but because this is all that he's done. This is where the world came from. It came from God, and therefore that is so huge that you can do nothing but worship.
There is a human impulse to worship. We are hardwired to worship. And we don't all worship the same way. We don't all worship through the same set of rituals or theologies. And at the same time, there is something in us that is drawn, as Augustine famously said, our hearts are restless until we rest in God. That's certainly been true for me. It may not be true for, we all may not describe it or language it the same way. But this inner will, this inner desire, this hardwiring to worship that or who is greater than we are, not just bigger, but greater.
More mysterious.
Yeah.
Well, and when you make that connection, then you get the peace that passeth all understanding. That that's part of the connection that comes with it.
I agree. And that comes more from prayer and centering and spending time with God than it does from words. Words are wonderful. And words engage the intellect and the heart, but a lot of the intellect. But, centering ourselves in prayer and the act of worship does lead to that peace, that sense of God's presence, that sense of awareness that God is our foundation, God is our source, and we are beloved by God. And that's, the world gives us a very different message. And to your point, Fred, I think part of the reason that people, there are lots of reasons people don't go to church. But one of them is that people get seduced by the gospel of the world and not the gospel of God, and don't understand. So, I don't think that the churches aren't full because of the theology in Job 38.
Oh, there are churches that are full because of that theology. That's the prosperity gospel.
Well,
and it's very appealing to very many people.
but I don't hear the prosperity gospel in this chapter. I hear
Not in this
reminder
chapter, but
of
in
who God is. Yeah.
the previous 37 chapters.
Well, and as you've pointed out, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, is that what we've been talking about all these weeks has been reflective of the theology of that time. And so it gives us, it's almost like a Rorschach or something to which we can respond, and we can say, well, it's not what I believe. And it's very helpful in clarifying, I think, what we ourselves believe and experience about God. Well, all of that to say, would somebody like to read 19 to 41, and we'll finish chapter 38 and move into 39?
Sure.
Thanks, Fred.
What is the way to the abode of light, and where does darkness reside? Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwelling? Surely you know, for you were already born, you have lived so many years. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or where the earth, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? Does the rain have a father? Who fathers the drops of dews, from whose womb comes the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the heavens when the waters become as hard as stone, when the surface of the deep is frozen? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the law of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, here we are? Who gives the ibis wisdom, or gives the rooster understanding? Who has wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of the earth stick together? Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or wait in the thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food?
You.
Are you still doubting, Fred?
He's not answering the question.
He's-
There's
yeah.
this very simple question he's been asked. What did I do to deserve this? And
And he's turning that question on its back on Job, saying, who do you think you are to ask?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm the one with the boils.
Boil schmoils.
I
You
mean,
didn't
what
create
he's
the
what
world,
he's in
so-
effect telling Job is you're insignificant, and I don't have to care about you.
Michael, where are you?
Do you think, does anyone hear that any differently? No?
I think we all hear it differently.
Does anyone want to speak to that then?
John, you're better.
You've got good words.
Yes.
Does anybody remember from Rite 1, if you've been part of the Episcopal Church for a while, and you may be familiar with worship in Rite 1, and the prayer of humble access, which is often prayed right before receiving communion. And it says, we are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under your table. But thou art the same Lord, whose property is always to have mercy.
Mercy.
And that, to me, I hear resonances of that here, that in and of ourselves, we aren't worthy. We are human, we are fallible, we are finite, we are human. We are not God. And God is merciful. God is the God of grace. So those two things can reside side by side. And so I think God does answer Job's question by saying, why do you think that you deserve all of this? Stay tuned for the end. But why do you think that, what hubris has led you to believe, you Job, to believe that you should be spared any suffering? Why does any of us think that we should be spared suffering? We can hope, we can pray, we can implore, but it's not a one-to-one correspondence. We know that. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people.
But we've also been told we've been blessed with reason, memory, and skill. And to use those, you have to make decisions. And, if the world, if God is just random in parceling out things, that doesn't work for me.
Okay. The author of Job would probably say, well, Fred, it doesn't have to work for you.
Yeah. You get boils.
But again,
Oh,
that's
you might be one of the bad people who gets all sorts of good things, Fred.
Yeah, well, I can live with that.
answer.
Put Fred on silent.
Fred has to say, it's wonderful. This is good because it's forcing all to get here. This kind of dialogue is so important in the life of faith. We don't all believe the same way. I don't think any two of us believes exactly the same way. And that's why it's so cool to listen to one another and to think about things from a different perspective. But Fred said something really important, about, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember your exact language, Fred, but really that God is doling out the bad stuff. And I know that in the book of Job, where we have that prologue, that prose section where we have the conversation between God and God's enemy, it's set up to sound like God has doled out the bad stuff in this exercise. Is that what we believe, that the bad things that happen to us come from God? That's a real question. I'd love to hear what you all think.
Personally, no.
Okay. Good.
Life is, has a lot of random chance in it, and God does not step up to even that out necessarily.
Or
What
even
you do have are the tools to overcome that.
Life is for sure random. I'm not sure God is random. That's what you had said before, that God was random. And I'm not sure where I stand on that.
I'm not sure God really, takes, I'm closer in this respect to Newton's clockwork universe.
That's what I hear. Yeah. I think most of us, if not all of us, can agree that the world and life certainly seem random, that horrible things happen. St. Louis yesterday, those 2 people killed in the school shooting. Why? Why? They happen to be in the wrong place, where someone very ill did something terribly evil. I don't think any one of us would say that that teacher and that student deserved to die that way in that place.
Or that it was God's fault they did.
Correct. Exactly. Did anybody have any observations about the rest of this chapter, or maybe language you really liked or didn't like? There was one point in your version, Fred, where it sounded like God was referring to God's self. Did anyone else catch that? There was one reference, Fred, and I don't remember which verse it was, where the name God was used, which it just struck me, because if it's God speaking, it seemed odd to me that God would talk about God in the third person. I don't know if anyone else noticed that. Do you find
verse
it?
23.
Was it 23?
33.
33. Would you mind reading that again in your translation?
Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth?
Okay, that's where it was. And that may just be a translation choice, but that struck me. Let's see what the Hebrew 33. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or fix their rule over the earth? Okay. It doesn't really help.
Yeah. The King James doesn't either.
Yeah, and as we know, the Hebrew in Job is complicated, and I wouldn't even begin to try to parse that out and figure out what it actually said. Is there anything else here in chapter 38 that we want to look at?
I was a little confused by the Fred's version of verse 36 about the ibis and intelligence to the rooster. And roosters are not necessarily known for intelligence. So I'm not sure what that was.
Yeah, and according to the interlinear, it doesn't mention the ibis or rooster at all. So I don't know where this translation is getting that. It does go on to talk about the lions. So it's, I'm fascinated by the active translation or interpretation, because there's always a spin, right? Whoever's doing that is doing it in a way that's consistent with a bigger picture that they have in their own mind. So where the ibis and the very intelligent rooster came from, I don't know. But I'm glad you pointed that out too, because roosters are known.
King James doesn't mention either the ibis or the rooster.
Really?
Yeah.
Does anybody's translation mention?
Yeah, the Good News does.
Interesting.
Who tells the ibis when the Nile will flood? Who tells the cock that rain will fall? But not in the King James Version. Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts? Or who hath given understanding to the heart? Completely different,
Let's see.
more encompassing.
And of
Footnotes,
course,
it's all saying meaning of Hebrew uncertain.
that's
On
the
all of
job.
Yeah, exactly. And mine says, yeah. Yeah.
Not very helpful. All right, well, does anyone mind if we move on to 39?
No, I can't wait.
No, let's go.
All right. All right, this is 30 verses. Would anyone like to read them? If you don't want to read the whole thing, maybe read part of it.
Seems to break in a few places.
Who will read?
I'll read.
Thank you, Ellie.
Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth, when they crouch to give birth to their offspring and are delivered of their young? Their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go forth and do not return to them. Who has let the wild ass go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift ass, to which I have given the steppe for its home, the salt land for its dwelling place? It scorns the tumult of the city. It does not hear the shouts of the driver. It ranges in the mountains as its pasture, and it searches after every green thing. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will it spend the night at your crib? Can you tie it in the furrow with ropes, or will it harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on it because its strength is great, and will you hand over your labor to it? Do you have faith in it that it will return and bring your grain to the threshing floor? The ostrich's wings flap wildly, though its pinions lack plumage, for it leaves its eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them and that a wild animal may trample them. It deals cruelly with its young as if they were not its own. Though its labor should be in vain, yet it has no fear, because God has made it forget wisdom and given it no share in understanding. When it spreads its plumes aloft, it laughs at the horse and its rider. Do you give the horse its might? Do you clothe its neck with mane? Do you make it leap like the locust? Its majestic snorting is terrible. It paws violently, exults mightily. It goes out to meet the weapons. It laughs at fear and is not dismayed. It does not turn back from the sword. Upon it rattled the quiver, the flashing spear, and the javelin. With fierceness and rage, it swallows the ground. It cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, it says, "Aha!" From a distance, it smells the battle, the thunder of the captains, and the shouting. Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and spreads its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? It lives on the rock and makes its home in the fastness of the rocky crag. From there it spies the prey, its eyes see it from far away. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is.
And I'm going to ask you, Ellie, if you would read just the first couple of verses of Job 40. It's actually just this.
And the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues with God must respond.
There we go. And then next week we can pick up with Job's response. So what do you all hear in chapter 39 and that little bit at the beginning of 40?
Once again, he's pointing out that that Job is not infinite and he's like the ostrich that just doesn't have the understanding that there is in nature.
Thank you. I'd love to read to you from this commentary that I've been using, John Goldingay, Job for Everyone, because I think he addresses some of what we've been talking about. And he writes, Yahweh's address to Job continues to remind him that as a human being, he is not the center of the animate world. It exists in its own right. God is the one who provides for lions and ravens. Whereas human beings in a traditional culture know all about domesticated goats and sheep, provide for them and watch over their birthing, it is God who watches over the birthing and maturing of wild goats and deer. It is God who provides a home in the steppe for the wild donkey and provides for the wild ox. Whereas domesticated donkeys and oxen are of crucial importance to humanity, wild donkeys are useless because they won't become subservient to human need. But they are still significant members of the animate world, and God provides for them. The ostrich is an even odder creature. It is a bird, but its wings don't enable it to fly properly, though it can run extraordinarily fast. It lays eggs, but according to legend, does not look after them properly, so that its laying becomes fruitful. It seems a silly creature, yet God made it as it is, with its exotic characteristics. The horse is an animal you have to take seriously. In Old Testament times, it was not a domesticated animal in the regular sense, but one more likely to be associated with warfare. It was kings who had horses. The hawk and the eagle are more accomplished and wise than the ostrich. As God is behind the quirkiness of the ostrich, I love that, God is behind the skill of these soaring birds. And then a little bit later, he says, God does not draw inferences for Job. God does not thereby fall into the trap of giving answers like the friends. Job thinks he wants answers, but in practice, the answers that people give sufferers usually fail to satisfy the sufferer in the way they satisfy the comforter. To be truthful, satisfying the comforter is what they're designed to do, because the comforter does not feel comfortable without answers. So I throw that out as a grenade into the discussion. Any thoughts or comments about the text or about the commentary?
I'd just say I thought the commentary was very helpful.
Good.
In terms of the wild beasts that were also domesticated and how he explains that
Mhm.
that was helpful.
What about this last salvo from God at the beginning of chapter 40? And the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues with God must respond. And that does sound like the great and powerful Oz to me, for sure. Thoughts about that or about any of this? Do we want to go on to look at chapter 40? We have a little bit of time left. We've got about 15 minutes. What's your pleasure, friends?
Let's go on.
All right,
Thing.
all right. So picking up.
Challenging Patty.
No, not at all. This is great. I think we're motivated. Would somebody like to pick up at Job 43 and then maybe read to the end of 40? So we have Job's quick response and then God picks up again.
Okay. I'd be happy to read.
Thank you, John.
Okay. Then Job answered the Lord, "See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but will proceed no further." Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you declare to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like his? Deck yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on all who are proud and abase them. Look on all who are proud and bring them low. Tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then I will also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can give you victory. Look at Behemoth, which I made just as I made you. It eats grass like an ox. Its strength is in its loins, and its power in the muscles of its belly. It makes its tail stiff like a cedar, and sinews of its thighs are knit together. Its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like bars of iron. It is the first of the great acts of God. Only its maker can approach it with a sword. For the mountains yield food for it, where all the wild animals play. Under the lotus plants it lies, in the covert of the reeds and in the marsh. The lotus trees cover it for shade. The willows of the wadi surround it. Even if the river is turbulent, it is not frightened. It is confident, though the Jordan rushes against its mouth. Can one take it with hooks or pierce its nose with a snare?
Thank you. So what is God's, well, first, what is Job saying? And then what is God saying in response?
He's been humble.
Do you like Job's response to God?
Job is cutting his losses.
No, he's humbled. Finally.
Mhm. He may not have actually expected an answer. Certainly not a whirlwind.
Not a whirlwind answer.
Sorry.
And then what about God's challenge to Job as the heading summarized?
7 and 8 are very much like the first part of God's speech in 36 or whenever it was.
Mhm.
I will question you and you answer.
And then more of the have you an arm like God and can you thunder with the voice? But it's so interesting. Again, God is referring to God's self in the third person. What about it? Verse 10, deck yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor.
If you can do all of this, then you can stand up and sass to me and make demands of me, but you can't, so pipe down.
Except when I read this, now God is saying, yeah, I am the guy who smites the wicked, and I bring down the people who are bad, and you know, which we were just saying, no, he does, that's not the way it's supposed to work. But So I was struck by this part, it stuck in here.
Yep.
If you can do all that, then you're God too, and we can speak as equals, but you don't. I love the description of the elephant, though, of the behemoth,
Hmm.
the first of the great acts of God.
My footnote in my Bible calls it the hippopotamus.
Yes,
And-
I've got a drawing of a hippo. in mine.
Oh,
But
Oh,
ties it to the Egyptian gods.
oh, right.
Apparently,
Hmm.
one of the first acts was the killing of the hippopotamus and the crocodile or whatever. So that's what ties that in.
That's right, because Leviathan is associated with the crocodile.
No, you're right. It's more, it is a better description of a hippopotamus than it is an elephant.
Mhm.
And more people are killed by hippos than elephants every year.
Hippos are terrifying.
Mm.
Mhm.
All begs the question of, if we are totally insignificant and totally, without power, why does God care?
Great question.
Because he is the God of mercy and he loves us.
But again, the God of mercy doesn't show up in this book.
And I see this as being presented as a fable.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
And this is not like, God actually speaking. This is
Correct.
somebody speaking, a theology.
Correct.
And the theology just doesn't work for me. Which, the theology of Job is, how dare you question the theology? I'm too insignificant to question the theology, but you have to have a theology and it has to make sense to you.
And that does make sense, that theology is a creation of humans, and therefore, as humans need it to make sense, humans need everything to make sense. That's why we're given inquiring minds and why we're so frequently unsatisfied.
I think
Or
that's a
like
very,
Fred refers to Goodell all the time. It's, you can't do it within the construct. You have to go beyond it, which is what God is. And that's when I start reaching out for getting out of my mind and getting, into my heart and other places.
me too, John. Me too. Because if we conceive of God, well, that's, I think my sentence began in a faulty way. We can't conceive of the wholeness of God, right? God, by definition, God is beyond human understanding. And so, going back to when you were talking earlier, Ellie, about the elephant, we've talked before about the blind man and the elephant. It's like we're all trying to understand, but we only have part of the story because we are finite. And so I think that's, to Fred's point about this being a fable, it's the author's attempts to wrestle with that which humans cannot fully understand, which, that's when my brain starts to hurt. It's like, wow, that's when okay. I gotta get out of my head, to John's point, because it is bigger and I cannot understand the fullness of God, no matter how hard I try. And the harder I try, sometimes the less I understand.
But there
It
has to
seems
be
like it's a
some,
fool's errand then,
Mm-hmm.
Either you accept it or you don't.
Well, and that's
And
why for me. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was I was going to say, Einstein said, God does not play dice with the universe.
Mhm.
And yet we're discovering maybe that's not exactly right.
Mm.
Wow. He didn't like quantum theory, but he is, and we don't understand it, but our whole society is based on it to a certain extent.
Certain extent, that's right.
I mean, you couldn't have transistors or GPS or, so many things without quantum theory.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's a good example because, we don't understand it, but it still has to make sense to us if we're going to, if we're going to have any relationship with it.
Yeah.
It can't just be out there. I mean, there are people who say, you just have to have faith and that's all you need. And, but you can't manipulate or understand or, you can't
change.
use it.
Mm.
It's not useful to you just based on faith.
But Patty, back to your point, every time you want to get into it, it's so seductive. You have to do it, even
Mhm.
though your brain hurts. I know exactly
Exactly.
where that is.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, we're just wired to do that. Part of our DNA.
Yep, I think that's right. Oh,
We have to have an answer for this.
yeah. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I think I'll speak for myself, and I think that I'm probably not alone in this, that part of the reason the theology that has been presented and explored in Job, part of the reason it's not fully satisfactory to us is that we are Christians and we understand God through the lens of Jesus, which is such a radical difference. In terms of relationality and justice and mercy and grace and peace and the love that we've been talking about. And so it's just, trying to have this conversation outside of the relationship with Jesus is, for me, impossible, because I can't forget or, dispense with what I know about God through the revelation of Christ. And that's where this gets, that's where I think we get caught up.
So how would Jesus respond to Job?
Great.
You're asking it. Possible.
I mean, it's a kind of a central question here, for at least for us.
Absolutely. And if we think about the parables, the one that comes to mind is one that so many of us just either we love it or we hate, the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where the people who come at 5 o'clock, the Johnny come latelys, get paid exactly the same as those who come at the beginning of the day and work their butts off out in the heat of the day. And that's not fair. And that just gets our goat, right? And so, I could imagine Jesus in dialogue with Job, and wouldn't that be interesting? To say, that's not how God's grace works. Yes, you say you shouldn't be getting, these bad things. Yes, you say that you show me what I've done that has caused this, but you're missing the point. I could easily imagine Jesus saying, you're asking the wrong question. Of course, he probably wouldn't say it directly. He would probably give us a parable to demonstrate.
Exactly. Yeah.
A parable within a parable.
What
Figure it
does
out
he
yourself.
mean?
Oh,
It's like golf, the guy American asked the Scottish caddy, he said, this game is not fair. And the caddy says it's not supposed to be.
mhm.
It's what it is.
Yeah. But going back to what Fred and Ellie have both said in their own ways, is that as humans, because we've been blessed with memory, reason, and skill, and that reason is a mixed blessing, because we think that, because A, then B, and the ways of God, your ways are not our ways. And so we can't reason our way to God or through God or about God the way we would like to. And for some people that's maddening, and for some people that's life-giving. Like, okay, I don't have to. And maybe there are a lot of people in between as well. But I think that's one of the things that Job is presenting to us, is that, this, and yes, to your point, Fred, in this fable, God is saying, yeah, I'm bigger than you. Yes, I've done all this. And there's certainly truth to that. And for us, it's more than that. Well, is this a good place for us to pause? I think we can finish Job next week, because we only have 41 and 42, and we did 2.5 chapters today. I think we can do it. Especially
Making miracles.
I know.
Yeah.
Ethan, you're gonna miss the
Yes, I
good.
didn't miss it,
Oh,
yeah.
Elin is
I don't know,
leaving us.
Elin, you should postpone your trip.
I know. Elin is
Oh,
leaving
you
us
can
with-
always tune in. You
That's
can
right.
always tune in.
Who knows? in an hour?
Probably be in my brother's car going home to his home from Winchester to Andover. Mm.
Well, you've got your phone. So
You got your-
Ellie's with us from Bologna. So
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, I have to connect to the internet though. I'd have to use his
Oh,
phone.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
You
All
Stop
right.
at a McDonald's for an hour.
That's it.
Okay.
Exactly.
What?
You're talking
Watch
about
the
my
re-
brother going to McDonald's?
Watch the recording. Watch the
Exactly.
recording,
That's a
England.
point. That's a point.
It's not as much fun to scream
then-
at the recording.
I know.
Okay.
And then
That's true.
send in your dissenting
more fun.
opinion.
Oh, so
Okay.
much more fun to interact. So last thing, what has anybody been thinking about any other suggestions for our next read? I've suggested Matthew because once we get to Advent at the end of November, we'll be in Matthew for this coming year primarily, with a little bit of John sprinkled in. And it might be timely to do that. And if somebody has another book that they'd like us to explore, we certainly can consider that. Any thoughts?
I have following on the Advent theme. I would like to know more about Isaiah. He is
Yeah.
often, but
Well,
it's such a
that will take us
large.
3 years at our rate.
It is
It's-
such a
it's-
large
It
undertaking.
is such a large book. I didn't know, Patty, are there cliff notes?
Well,
Reader's Digest.
let me think about what we might do.
But aren't there 3 different parts to it, or 3
Yes.
different authors of it?
Yeah.
Maybe we
Yeah.
could do one of them more, but I kind of like doing Matthew because we haven't done a gospel of fuller.
For a while, yeah.
Well, and
Yeah,
the
that's
thing
a
about
part.
Matthew is that Matthew is all about demonstrating that the coming of Christ fulfills the prophecy, fulfills the scripture. So we may be able, what I'm thinking is that we could do some, I could do some very intentional pairing of some Matthew and some Isaiah, so that we hear the text. I mean, it's not all Isaiah that Matthew quotes, but it's like, so that we text. Let me think about how I can frame it, because I agree with you, Fred, that's, that would be really good for Advent. But I also agree that it really probably would take us 3 years to do. It's taken us 20 sessions to do, or by next week, it'll take 21 sessions to do Job. And we read Job faster than we've read some of the other texts. So, because it's so repetitive, I think we were able to kind of fast forward in some places.
Mhm.
Well, let's try to finish Job next week. And then I suggest that we read Matthew, but in strategic conversation with Isaiah, and I'll figure out
That
what
sounds great.
that
That
could be
sounds
really
good.
All right. Marietta, I will see you at 3:30.
Okay,
And
Thank you.
happy birthday. And
thank you.
all for spending this hour together. This is always the highlight of the week for me.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Patty.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Patty.
All right. Bye,
Bye.
my friends.
Bye, all.
Bye.